When Thomas Mitchell stepped off the train in Silver Creek with only $20 to his name, he never imagined he'd spend it all on a single, life-altering decision at a human auction. What started as an impulsive act of conscience would spark a love story that defied every social convention of 1885, but would their forbidden union survive the fury of an entire town determined to tear them apart. The train screeched to a halt like a dying animal, sending black smoke rolling across the wooden platform. Thomas Mitchell grabbed his single leather bag and jumped down onto the rough planks. His fancy Boston shoes slipped on the dusty wood, making him stumble forward like a newborn colt. Silver Creek stretched out before him like a child's drawing of the Wild West. Wooden buildings lined both sides of a dirt road that looked more like a cow path. Signs hung crooked from rusty nails, and horses tied to hitching posts swished their tails at buzzing flies. The whole place smelled like sawdust, horse manure, and something else Thomas couldn't name. His stomach growled loud enough to wake a sleeping bear. The $20 in his coat pocket felt lighter than a feather now that he saw how far from Boston he really was. Back home, $20 bought a nice dinner and a night at the theater. Out here, it might be all that stood between him and sleeping under the stars. A group of rough-looking men stood near the general store, their eyes following Thomas like wolves watching a lost sheep. Their clothes were dirty and patched, their faces burned brown by the mountain sun. One man spit tobacco juice into the dirt and said something that made the others laugh. Thomas pulled his coat tighter and tried to look like he belonged. The sound of his father's voice echoed in his head like thunder in a canyon. "You'll never make it on your own, boy. Without the Mitchell name, you're nothing but another failure waiting to happen." Those words had driven Thomas onto the westbound train, but now they felt more like truth than insult. A woman in a faded blue dress swept the porch of what looked like a boarding house. When Thomas tipped his hat to her, she looked him up and down like she was pricing a piece of meat at the butcher shop. Her eyes stopped on his clean clothes and soft hands, and her mouth turned down like she'd tasted something sour. "You lost, mister," she called out, her voice sharp as broken glass. "No, ma'am," Thomas replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Just arrived on the evening train." "Well, ain't that something," she muttered, going back to her sweeping with harder strokes. "Another city boy come to play cowboy." The word stung worse than a wasp, but Thomas kept walking. He needed to find work, food, and a place to sleep, in that order. The lumber mill at the edge of town looked promising, with its tall smokestack reaching toward the darkening sky like a pointing finger. As he walked down the main street, Thomas noticed how people moved out of his way. Not with respect, but like they were avoiding a disease. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, whispering and giggling. A dog barked at him from under a wagon, showing teeth yellow as old corn. The general store's windows glowed with warm lamplight, making it look like a safe harbor in a storm. Thomas pushed through the door, setting off a bell that clanged like a church calling people to prayer. The storekeeper, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked up from his ledger book. "Help you?" the man asked, but his tone suggested he'd rather help Thomas find the door. "I need supplies," Thomas said, pulling out his precious $20 bill. "Food, maybe some work clothes." The storekeeper's eyes widened at the sight of real money. His whole manner changed like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Well now, that's different. Name's Wheeler, Sam Wheeler. Welcome to Silver Creek, Mr. Mitchell. Thomas Mitchell. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Mitchell. What brings you to our little piece of paradise?" Before Thomas could answer, shouting erupted from outside. Men's voices rose and fell like waves crashing on rocks. Wheeler's face went pale as morning mist. "What's all that noise?" Thomas asked. Wheeler looked toward the door like it might burst into flames. "Auction," he said quietly. "They hold them in the town square when the mood strikes." "What kind of auction?" Wheeler's jaw worked like he was chewing tough meat. "The kind decent folks don't talk about," he finally said. "But the kind that keeps this town running, if you catch my meaning." Thomas didn't catch his meaning, but the shouting outside grew louder. Through the window, he could see people gathering in the square like ants around spilled honey. Lanterns bobbed in the growing darkness, casting dancing shadows on eager faces. "I should probably find a room for the night," Thomas said, but his feet seemed rooted to the floor. Something about the crowd outside pulled at him like a fishhook in his gut. "Mrs. Patterson runs the boarding house," Wheeler said, but his eyes kept darting to the window. "Clean beds, decent food. Tell her I sent you." The shouting outside reached a peak, then suddenly dropped to an excited murmur. Thomas felt his heart speed up like a runaway horse. Whatever was happening out there, it was about to begin. Thomas stepped out of the general store into air thick with excitement and something darker. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, all pushing toward a wooden platform that hadn't been there when the train arrived. Lanterns hung from poles stuck in the ground, creating a circle of flickering light in the mountain darkness. A fat man in a black suit stood on the platform, his voice booming across the square like thunder rolling down a mountainside. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's special auction. We've got some fine merchandise for your consideration." Thomas's blood turned cold as winter water. Merchandise? The word hit him like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't an auction for horses or farm equipment. First up, the auctioneer continued, "We have this strong young buck, fresh from the cotton fields of Alabama." A black man, maybe 20 years old, was pushed onto the platform. His clothes were torn and dirty, his hands tied behind his back. But his eyes burned with a fire that made Thomas step back. The man's gaze swept across the crowd like he was memorizing every face for some future reckoning. "Bidding starts at $50, the auctioneer called out. "60, someone shouted from the back. "70, 80. Thomas felt sick to his stomach. This was 1885, not 1855. Slavery was supposed to be over, finished, dead and buried with the Civil War. But here it was, alive and breathing in the flickering lantern light of Silver Creek's town square. "Sold for $90 to Mr. Morrison." The auctioneer's gavel came down like a judge's final sentence. Jake Morrison, one of the men Thomas had seen earlier, stepped forward with a satisfied grin. He was a big man with hands like ham hocks and eyes that reminded Thomas of a snake's. Cold and calculating. "Next item," the auctioneer called out like he was selling cattle at a county fair. This time, a woman was brought forward. Middle-aged, with skin the color of coffee and cream, she walked with her head held high despite the rope around her wrists. When someone in the crowd made a crude comment, she turned and stared at him until he looked away like a scolded child. The bidding was quieter this time, less enthusiastic. These people had bills to pay and mouths to feed, and $90 was more than most of them saw in 3 months. The woman sold for $45 to a rancher Thomas didn't recognize. "And now," the auctioneer said, his voice dropping to create suspense like a preacher building to the climax of his sermon, "our final item of the evening. Something special for the discerning gentleman." A young Chinese woman was led onto the platform, and Thomas felt the world tilt sideways like a ship in a storm. She couldn't have been more than 18, with long black hair braided down her back and a face that belonged in a painting, not a slave auction. Her dress was simple but clean, and she wore a small jade bracelet that caught the lantern light. But it was her eyes that grabbed Thomas and wouldn't let go. Dark as midnight but bright with intelligence, they swept across the crowd without fear or pleading. She stood straight as a pine tree like she was made of something stronger than the ropes that bound her. "This little China doll came to us from San Francisco," the auctioneer said, his voice thick with false cheer. "Young, healthy, and already trained in the domestic arts. She can cook, clean, sew, and I'm told she speaks passable English." A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Chinese people were still rare in Silver Creek, exotic as peacocks in a chicken coop. Some folks stared with curiosity, others with suspicion, and a few with something uglier that made Thomas's hands clench into fists. "What am I bid for this oriental beauty?" the auctioneer called out. Silence stretched like a bowstring about to snap. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Around him, men shifted their feet and cleared their throats, but no one spoke up. "Come now, gentlemen," the auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip. "Surely someone appreciates fine merchandise when they see it." More silence. Thomas realized with growing horror that nobody wanted her. Not because she wasn't valuable, but because she was Chinese. In their eyes, that made her less than human, less than worth owning. $1, someone finally called out from the back of the crowd, and cruel laughter rippled through the gathered people like poison in a stream. The auctioneer's face turned red as a sunset. "Surely we can do better than $1 for such a fine specimen." But the crowd had already lost interest. They'd gotten their entertainment for the evening, seen their neighbors spend money they probably didn't have, and now they wanted to get home to their warm beds and cold suppers. Thomas looked at the young woman on the platform. Li Mei, he would later learn her name was, though at that moment she was just a stranger in desperate need. Her eyes met his across the crowd, and something passed between them. Not love, not even attraction, but recognition. Two lost souls acknowledging each other in a sea of indifference. "Going once for $1, the auctioneer called out desperately. Thomas's hand went to the $20 bill in his pocket. $20 that was supposed to buy food, shelter, and a new start. $20 that stood between him and sleeping under the stars. "Going twice." The young woman's chin lifted higher, and Thomas saw her preparing for whatever came next. Slavery to whoever had bid that insulting dollar, or something worse if no one claimed her at all. In territories like this, unwanted human cargo often simply disappeared into the night. Thomas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His father's voice whispered in his head, "Don't be a fool, boy. You can't save everyone." But another voice, quieter but stronger, whispered back, "Maybe not everyone, but maybe someone." "I'll take her," Thomas heard himself say, his voice cutting through the night air like a knife through butter. "I'll take her for $1. The cabin door creaked like old bones as Thomas pushed it open, his heart hammering against his ribs. Li Mei stepped inside first, her bare feet silent on the rough wooden floor. The single room felt smaller with 2 people in it, just a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in weeks. "You can sleep there," Thomas said, pointing to the bed. His voice cracked like a teenage boy's. "I'll take the floor." Li Mei turned to face him, her dark eyes studying his face like she was reading a book written in a language she barely knew. "Why you do this?" The question hit Thomas harder than a punch. He'd been asking himself the same thing since the moment he'd opened his mouth at that auction. "I don't know," he said, then realized how stupid that sounded. "I mean, I couldn't just, they were treating you like thing to buy and sell," Li Mei finished. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, like she was talking about the weather. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, like that." She walked to the single window and looked out at the darkening sky. "In China, my father sell me too. Say I bring shame to family because I not marry man he choose. Say America better for me." She laughed, but it sounded more like crying. Maybe he right. Maybe being sold for $1 better than being sold to old man with 3 wives who beat them all. The words hung in the air like smoke. Thomas felt sick thinking about what she'd been through, what she'd run from, only to end up on that platform tonight. "What's your real story?" he asked quietly. Li Mei was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, still looking out the window. "I have brother. Younger brother, very smart. Family save money to send him to school, but not enough. Father say if I marry rich old man, dowry pay for brother's education." She touched the jade bracelet on her wrist. "I say no. I run away at night with only this bracelet from my grandmother." Thomas sat down heavily in one of the chairs. "How did you get to America?" "Man in village say he know captain of ship going to Gold Mountain. Say captain need workers, pay good money. I believe him." Her laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. "Ship captain not need workers. He need girls to sell in America." The pieces clicked together in Thomas's mind like a horrible puzzle. "You were trafficked." Li Mei turned from the window. "What this word mean?" "It means you were tricked. Stolen. Sold like cargo." She nodded slowly. "Yes. This happened to many Chinese girls. We think we come for work, for better life. Instead, we become slaves." Thomas felt anger building in his chest, hot and tight. "How many girls were with you?" 12 on ship. By time we reach San Francisco, only 8 still alive. 2 get sick and die. 1 jump in ocean during storm. 1 just stop eating, stop talking, stop living." The room felt colder suddenly, like winter had snuck in through the cracks in the walls. Thomas wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but every word that came to mind sounded empty and useless. "What happened to the other girls?" he asked. "Sold in different places. Some to houses where men come to, you know. Others to rich families as servants. I get lucky, man who buy me in San Francisco just want cook and cleaner. He not bad man, just lonely widower. But then he die of heart attack 2 months ago. And then." Li Mei sat down in the other chair, suddenly looking very tired. "His son not want Chinese servant. Say I remind him too much of his father's strange ways. So he bring me here, sell me to get rid of problem." Thomas stared at the table between them, his mind spinning. This girl, this young woman, had survived more in her 18 years than most people face in a lifetime. And here he was, feeling sorry for himself because his father called him worthless. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Why you sorry? You not do these things to me." Because no one should have to go through what you've been through. Because the world can be cruel and unfair, and good people get hurt while bad people get rich." Li Mei studied his face again. "You very strange white man. Most white men, they not care what happened to Chinese girl. Maybe I'm not like most white men. Maybe." She was quiet for a moment. "What your story? Why you come to this place with only $1? Thomas almost smiled. "My story's not nearly as interesting as yours. Rich boy from Boston disappoints his father one too many times. Father cuts him off, tells him to make his own way in the world. Boy runs west thinking he'll prove himself, but turns out he doesn't know how to do anything useful. You know how to read and write? Yes. You know numbers? Yes. Then you know more than most people here. That worth something. Thomas looked at her with new respect. Even after everything she'd been through, she could still see the good in a situation. You're pretty smart yourself. Smart not always enough. In China, I read and write better than my brother, but he the one family want to educate. Here in America, I speak English better than many Chinese men, but still just girl to be bought and sold. The fire crackled softly as they sat in comfortable silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the whole cabin creak like a ship at sea. Li Mei, Thomas said carefully, what do you want to do now? She looked at him with surprise, like no one had ever asked her that question before. What you mean? I mean, you're not my property. I don't own you. You can leave if you want. You can stay if you want. You can do whatever you think is best for your life. Tears appeared in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. No one ever asked me what I want before. I'm asking now. She was quiet for a long time, thinking. Finally, she spoke. I want to learn to live like a free person. I want to work and earn money and make my own choices. But I not know how to do these things in America. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening that had been locked for years. Maybe we could figure it out together. 3 weeks passed like pages turning in a book Thomas couldn't put down. Each morning brought new discoveries about the woman sharing his small cabin, and each discovery made him realize how little he actually knew about surviving in the world. Li Mei woke before dawn every day, moving quietly around the cabin so she wouldn't disturb his sleep. By the time Thomas opened his eyes, she'd already started a fire, heated water for washing, and begun preparing breakfast from whatever supplies they had. She never complained about the meager food or the cold mornings, but Thomas noticed how she made every grain of rice count, how she stretched their supplies with wild plants she'd learned to identify. Where did you learn to do all this? He asked one morning, watching her turn their last 2 eggs into a meal that somehow fed them both. Necessity, Li Mei said simply. On ship, we get very little food. Learn to make much from little or starve. Thomas felt ashamed of his own helplessness. He'd grown up with servants who cooked his meals, cleaned his clothes, and managed every detail of his daily life. Now, watching Li Mei work, he realized he'd never truly taken care of himself a single day in his life. Teach me, he said. Li Mei looked up from the small pot where she was cooking rice. Teach you what? Everything. How to make food last longer. How to keep the cabin warm without using too much wood. How to live like this. She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Why you want to learn? You rich Boston boy. You go home when you get tired of playing poor. The words stung because they held truth. Maybe I don't want to go home. Maybe I want to make a real life here. Real life very different from game, Thomas Mitchell. Over the following days, Li Mei became his teacher in ways he never expected. She showed him how to bank the fire at night so it wouldn't die but wouldn't waste precious wood. She taught him to recognize which plants growing wild around the cabin were edible and which were poison. She demonstrated how to patch holes in clothes so the repairs would hold through multiple washings. But the most important lessons weren't about survival skills. They were about seeing the world through different eyes. You walk like man who never been afraid, Li Mei told him one afternoon as they gathered firewood. Head up, shoulders back, like you own everything you see. Thomas paused, a bundle of sticks in his arms. Is that bad? Not bad. Just different. I walk like this. She demonstrated, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes down, movements quick and quiet. Walk like person who might need to hide or run. The difference was startling. Thomas had never realized how much confidence showed in a person's walk, how much privilege was displayed in simply taking up space without apology. Can you teach me to walk differently? He asked. Li Mei looked puzzled. Why you want to walk like frightened person? Not frightened. Just less obvious. Sometimes it might be better not to look like I think I own everything. She studied his face. You planning to do something dangerous? Thomas hadn't been planning anything specific, but her question made him think. They couldn't hide in the cabin forever. Eventually, they'd need to find work, buy supplies, interact with the town. And when they did, the less attention they drew to themselves, the better. Maybe, he said. This town isn't exactly friendly to Chinese people. Or to people who help Chinese people. Li Mei nodded grimly. I know this. I see how people look at me when I go to buy rice. Like I am disease they might catch. You've been going to town? Only to Chinese store. Old man there, Mr. Chin, he sell rice and vegetables. He tell me about other Chinese families here, warn me about which streets to avoid, which white men cause trouble. Thomas felt a stab of guilt. While he'd been learning to cook and mend clothes, Li Mei had been navigating the dangerous social landscape of Silver Creek alone. Why didn't you tell me you were going to town? You not ask. And I not want to bring trouble to you. Li Mei, we're in this together now. You don't have to protect me from trouble. She gave him a look that was half amusement, half pity. Thomas, you sweet man, but you not understand. Trouble find Chinese girl no matter what she do. Question is whether trouble find you too when you with her. Her words hit him like cold water. He'd been thinking about their situation like it was an adventure, a challenge to overcome. But for Li Mei, it was a matter of survival in a world that saw her as less than human. What kind of trouble? He asked. Li Mei set down her bundle of wood and sat on a fallen log. Mr. Chen, tell me stories. Chinese men in next county, he work hard, save money, try to start business. White men burn down his shop, say Chinese not allowed to compete with white merchants. Another man, he marry white woman from back east. Someone poison their well water. Woman get very sick, nearly die. Thomas felt his stomach clench. That's horrible. Is normal, Li Mei said matter-of-factly. Chinese people in America, we always walk careful. We learn which white people might help and which will hurt. We learn to make ourselves small, invisible when possible. But you shouldn't have to live like that. Should and is are different things. She stood up and picked up her wood again. Question is, what kind of life you want? Safe and quiet, or something else? The question followed Thomas back to the cabin and stayed with him through the evening. What kind of life did he want? For the first time since leaving Boston, he was starting to understand what that life might look like. It wouldn't be easy or comfortable or safe, but it might be real in a way his old life never was. That night, as they sat by the fire, Thomas made a decision. Li Mei, I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. She looked up from the sewing she was doing, mending a tear in one of his shirts. What question? Do you trust me? She was quiet for a long moment, her needle paused in mid-stitch. Why you ask this? Because I have an idea. But it only works if we trust each other completely. Li Mei set down her sewing and looked directly into his eyes. What your idea? Thomas took a deep breath. I think we should stop hiding. The sun barely peeked over the mountains when Thomas heard the first whisper. Mrs. Henderson turned away from him at the general store, clutching her shawl tight like he carried some terrible disease. Her lips moved in hushed words to another woman, their eyes darting toward him with looks that made his stomach twist. By noon, 3 more people had crossed the street to avoid him. The blacksmith, who usually waved and called out greetings, suddenly found his horseshoes very interesting when Thomas walked by. Even young Billy Santos, who always asked about life back east, ducked into an alley when he saw Thomas coming. Something was terribly wrong in Silver Creek. Thomas pushed through the swinging doors of Murphy's saloon, hoping to find answers in the dim, smoky air. The usual chatter died like someone had blown out a candle. 12 pairs of eyes stared at him from the bar and card tables. Not friendly curiosity, cold, hard stares that made his skin crawl. Well, drawled Jake Morrison from his corner table. Look what the cat dragged in. Thomas straightened his shoulders, fighting the urge to back toward the door. Afternoon, Jake. Boys. Nobody returned his greeting. The silence stretched like taffy, sticky and uncomfortable. Finally, old Pete the bartender spoke up, his voice rough as sandpaper. Heard you got yourself some interesting company, Mitchell. Not sure what you mean, Pete. Morrison's chair scraped against the wooden floor as he stood. His hand rested on his gun belt, fingers drumming a nervous rhythm. Oh, I think you know exactly what he means. The whole town's talking about your little arrangement. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. My living situation isn't anyone's business but mine. See, that's where you're wrong, Morrison said, stepping closer. His breath smelled of whiskey and tobacco. When a man brings shame on a decent town, it becomes everyone's business. Shame. Thomas's voice cracked slightly. What shame? Don't play dumb with us, boy. This came from Hank Wheeler, the store owner's brother. Living in sin with that Chinese girl like some kind of animal. It ain't Christian. It ain't decent. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He glanced around the room, seeing disgust and anger on every face. These men he'd worked alongside, shared drinks with, considered neighbors, they looked at him now like he was something dirty they'd scraped off their boots. Li Mei is a guest in my home, Thomas said carefully. Nothing more. Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. Guessed? Boy, you bought her fair and square. Everyone saw it. What you do with your property behind closed doors is between you and the good Lord, but don't insult our intelligence by calling it something pretty. She's not property, Thomas said, his voice gaining strength. She's a human being. Human being? Hank spat into the spittoon beside his chair. That yellow girl ain't even the same species as us. And a decent white man don't lower himself to, well, to whatever it is you're doing with her. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. Every muscle in his body screamed to defend Lee May's honor, to make these men take back their cruel words. But he was outnumbered 12-1, and most of these men carried guns. I think there's been some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding at all, Morrison interrupted. Preacher's wife saw you two through the window yesterday evening. Sitting by the fire like husband and wife. Sharing a meal off the same plate. Looking all cozy and familiar. Thomas's heart sank. Mrs. Patterson. Of course she'd been spying, twisting innocent moments into something ugly. We were eating dinner, Thomas said. People do that. Not decent people, Hank said. Not with their kind. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Thomas heard words that made his blood boil, words he'd never imagined coming from the mouths of men he'd respected. They spoke about Lee May like she was less than human, about him like he'd lost his mind. Listen, Morrison said, his voice taking on a false friendliness that was somehow worse than his anger. We understand you're new here. Maybe back east, things are different. But in Silver Creek, we got standards. We got rules about how decent folk behave. What kind of rules? Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. Well, for starters, white men don't live with Chinese women. Not proper-like, anyway. If you need the kind of companionship, there's ways to handle it that don't scandalize the whole town. Thomas felt sick. They wanted him to treat Lee May like the women who worked in the cribs behind the saloon, used and discarded, hidden away like a shameful secret. That's not what this is, he said firmly. Then what is it? Morrison's voice turned sharp again. You gonna tell us you bought yourself a servant girl? Maybe a cook? Because if that's the case, she should be working for other folks too. Earning her keep proper. Thomas realized the trap they were setting. If he claimed Lee May was his servant, they'd demand she work for them at wages they'd set, under conditions they'd control. If he admitted their relationship was more personal, they'd brand him a deviant and her a whore. My arrangement with Lee May is private, he said. Private? Morrison laughed again. Son, nothing's private in a town this size. Especially when it involves corrupting the moral character of decent Christian folk. How am I corrupting anyone? By example, said a new voice. Thomas turned to see Reverend Patterson pushing through the saloon doors, his face red with righteous anger. Young men see you living in sin without consequence. They think it's acceptable behavior. Young women see that Oriental girl acting like she belongs among respectable people. They get ideas above their station. The Reverend's wife appeared behind him, her thin lips pressed into a hard line. I seen them, Harold. Seen them through the window, sitting close as lovers. Talking and laughing like they was equals. It's an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. Thomas felt the walls closing in around him. More people were pushing into the saloon now, shopkeepers, farmers, women who rarely set foot in such places. Word had spread through town like wildfire, drawing a crowd hungry for confrontation. Now, Thomas, Reverend Patterson said in his Sunday sermon voice, I don't believe you're an evil man. Misguided, perhaps. Led astray by unnatural desires. But there's still time to make this right. Make what right? Send the girl away, Mrs. Patterson said sharply. Sell her to someone who'll handle her proper. Use the money to buy yourself a decent woman, a white woman who can bear you Christian children and keep a proper home. The crowd murmured approval. Thomas looked around at faces he'd thought he knew, seeing them clearly for the first time. Fear and hatred twisted their features into ugly masks. These people weren't concerned about his soul or Lee May's welfare. They were terrified of anything different, anything that challenged their narrow view of how the world should work. And if I refuse? Thomas asked. Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun. Well, that would be unfortunate. For both of you. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Thomas understood now that this wasn't just about social disapproval or religious concerns. This was about power, about keeping people like Lee May in their place and punishing anyone who dared to treat them as equals. I need time to think, Thomas said, hating himself for the cowardice in his voice. You got until Sunday, Reverend Patterson said. Come to church service and publicly renounce your sinful ways or face the consequences. What consequences? Morrison smiled, and it was the coldest thing Thomas had ever seen. Let's just say Silver Creek has ways of dealing with folks who don't fit in. Ways that don't require the sheriff's involvement, if you catch my meaning. Thomas caught his meaning perfectly. He was being threatened with violence, maybe death, if he didn't abandon Li Mei to whatever fate these people had in mind for her. Sunday, Morrison repeated. High noon service. Don't disappoint us, boy. Thomas burst through the cabin door like a man fleeing flames, his face pale and his hands shaking. Li Mei looked up from her sewing, immediately sensing the terror radiating from him like heat from a fever. What happened? She asked, setting down her needle and thread. Thomas paced the small room like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair until it stood in wild tufts. They know. The whole town knows about us living together. They think we're... He couldn't finish the sentence. Li Mei's stomach dropped. She'd known this day would come, had felt the stares and whispers growing stronger each time she ventured into town. What they say? Terrible things, Thomas said, his voice breaking. About you. About us. They want me to send you away, or... He stopped pacing and looked at her with eyes full of fear. Li Mei, I think they might hurt us if we don't do what they want. She nodded slowly, unsurprised but still feeling the words like a physical blow. This is America, she said quietly. Land of free, yes? But not free for Chinese girl. Thomas slammed his fist against the wall, making the whole cabin shudder. It's not right. You haven't done anything wrong. Neither have I. We're not hurting anyone. In their eyes, we hurt their idea of how world should be, Li Mei said with the tired wisdom of someone who'd faced hatred before. Chinese not supposed to live like real person. Supposed to stay in Chinatown, work for pennies, keep head down. White man not supposed to treat Chinese like equal. But you are equal, Thomas said fiercely. You're smarter than half the men in this town, braver than all of them put together. Li Mei's heart ached at the pain in his voice. This good man who'd tried to save her was now trapped in the same web of hatred that had ensnared her from the moment she'd stepped off the boat in San Francisco. Thomas, she said gently, you should listen to them. He spun around, staring at her in shock. What? Send me away. Tell them you sorry, you make mistake. Go to their church, say their words, marry one of their white girls. Her voice stayed steady despite the tears burning behind her eyes. You can still have good life here. Without you. Thomas shook his head violently. Never. I won't abandon you to face this alone. You think you protect me? You think your kindness can stop their hate? Li Mei stood up, her small frame somehow commanding the room. I survive worse than this. In China, bandits burn my village. On ship to America, men try to hurt me. In San Francisco, bosses work us like animals and pay nothing. I still here. I still fighting. Thomas stared at her, seeing for the first time the steel backbone that had kept her alive through horrors he could barely imagine. You're the strongest person I've ever met. Strong enough to know when battle cannot be won, she replied. You good man, Thomas. Best man I ever know. But you cannot change whole town. You cannot make them see Chinese girl as human being. A knock at the door interrupted them, 3 sharp raps that made them both freeze. Thomas moved to the window and peered through the curtain. His face went white. It's Sheriff Cooper, he whispered. And he's not alone. Li Mei joined him at the window. The sheriff stood on their porch with 2 deputies, their hands resting on their gun belts. Behind them, a small crowd had gathered in the street, townspeople holding lanterns, their faces grim in the flickering light. Maybe they just want to talk, Thomas said, but his voice held no conviction. Another knock, harder this time. Mitchell. Open up. We need to have a word. Thomas looked at Li Mei, seeing his own fear reflected in her dark eyes. Whatever came next, their quiet life together was over. The storm they both sensed building had finally arrived. Remember, Li Mei whispered, no matter what happened, you are a good man. Do not let them make you forget. Thomas reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly. Behind the thin wooden barrier waited the consequences of his choice to treat another human being with dignity and respect. In 1885 Silver Creek, Colorado, that was apparently a crime worthy of the law's attention. We're coming, Thomas called out, his voice stronger than he felt. As he opened the door to face whatever judgment awaited them, Li Mei moved to stand beside him, not behind him like a cowering servant, but next to him like an equal. If this was to be their final stand together, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her across an ocean and through countless trials. The sheriff's weathered face was unreadable in the lamplight. Evening, folks. I'm afraid we have a problem that needs sorting out. The sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet evening like thunder. Thomas shot up from his chair as rocks crashed through their cabin windows, sending sharp pieces flying across the wooden floor. Li Mei dropped her sewing and rushed to blow out the oil lamp, plunging them into darkness. "Come out here, Mitchell." Jake Morrison's voice boomed from outside. "Time for you and your yellow wife to pack up and leave." Thomas felt his hands shake as he reached for the rifle above the fireplace. He had never fired it at another person, but tonight might be different. Through the broken window, he could see torches flickering in the hands of at least 8 men. Their faces looked like angry masks in the dancing light. "What do they want?" Li Mei whispered, her voice steady despite the fear Thomas could hear underneath. "They want us gone," Thomas replied, checking to make sure the rifle was loaded. "But we're not going anywhere." Another rock hit the cabin wall with a loud thump. Then came Morrison's voice again, cruel and mocking. "We know you're in there. Come out now, or we'll burn you out." Thomas moved to the window and called back, "This is my home, Morrison. You have no right to threaten us." "You're home." Morrison laughed and the other men joined in. "This ain't your home anymore, Mitchell. Town voted tonight. We don't want your kind here." Li Mei crawled across the floor to join Thomas at the window. "How many?" she asked. "Too many," Thomas admitted. His heart was beating so fast he thought it might burst. "But maybe we can reason with them." "You cannot reason with hate," Li Mei said quietly. "In San Francisco, I saw what angry men do. They do not listen to words." Outside, someone was pouring something liquid around the base of the cabin. The smell of kerosene drifted through the broken windows. Thomas felt sick to his stomach. These men really meant to burn them out. "Last chance, Mitchell," Morrison shouted. "Come out peaceful or come out screaming." Thomas looked at Li Mei in the darkness. Her face was calm, but he could see the determination in her eyes. She was not going to run. Neither was he. "We stay," Thomas said firmly. Li Mei nodded. "We stay." But just as Morrison struck a match, the sound of horse hooves thundered down the street. Someone was riding hard and fast toward the cabin. The torchlight revealed Sheriff Cooper jumping down from his horse, his gun already drawn. "That's enough." Cooper's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Drop those torches right now." Morrison turned to face the sheriff, his match still burning. "This ain't your business, Ben. Town's made its decision." "Town doesn't get to decide who lives where," Cooper replied, his gun steady in his hand. "And it sure doesn't get to burn people out of their homes." "You taking sides with them?" Morrison's voice was full of poison. "With a white man who married a Chinaman?" Cooper's jaw tightened. "I'm taking sides with the law. And the law says you boys are about to commit arson. That's 5 years in prison." The men behind Morrison shuffled their feet nervously. They had come for a quick solution to their problem, not a fight with the law. "Think about your families," Cooper continued, his voice softer now. "Think about your children. You want them to grow up knowing their daddy was a criminal? That he burned innocent people out of their home?" One by one, the torches began to lower. These were not evil men, Thomas realized. They were scared men who had let their fear turn to anger. But fear could be reasoned with, even if anger could not. "Go home," Cooper said firmly. "All of you. Before you do something you'll regret for the rest of your lives." Morrison looked around at his followers, seeing the doubt in their faces. His power was slipping away like sand through his fingers. "This ain't over," he said, but his voice had lost its fire. "Yes, it is," Cooper replied. "It's over right now." As the men walked away into the darkness, Thomas felt his legs go weak with relief. Li Mei touched his arm gently. "You did not have to stay," she said softly. Thomas looked at her, this brave woman who had faced down a mob without flinching. "Yes, I did," he said. "This is our home. Our life. I'm not letting anyone take that away from us." Through the broken window, they watched Sheriff Cooper check the ground around their cabin, making sure all the kerosene had been scattered and couldn't catch fire. "You folks all right in there?" he called. "We're fine, Sheriff," Thomas replied. "Thanks to you." Cooper walked over to the window. "I can't promise this won't happen again," he said honestly. "Some folks in this town have hard hearts. But I can promise I'll do my job, no matter what." "That's all we ask," Li Mei said. After Cooper rode away, Thomas and Li Mei sat together in their dark cabin, surrounded by broken glass and the smell of kerosene. But instead of feeling defeated, Thomas felt something new growing inside him. Strength. Purpose. The knowledge that he had found something worth fighting for. "We'll fix the windows tomorrow," he said. "Yes," Li Mei agreed. "And we'll make this place even stronger than before." As they cleaned up the glass by candlelight, Thomas wondered what other tests lay ahead. Because one thing was certain, tonight had not been the end of their troubles. It had only been the beginning. Sheriff Ben Cooper sat in his office the next morning, staring at the stack of papers on his desk. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. His mind kept going back to the scene at the Mitchell cabin and the choice he had made in those crucial seconds. The door opened with a loud creak and Mayor Whitman walked in. His face was red with anger and his expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he was sweating despite the cool morning air. "Ben, we need to talk," the mayor said, not bothering with polite greetings. Cooper leaned back in his chair and studied the man who had helped him get elected. "Morning, Harold. You look upset about something." "Upset?" Whitman slammed his hand down on Cooper's desk, making the cold coffee jump in its cup. "Half the town council is calling for your badge. You drew your gun on decent citizens last night." "I drew my gun on men who were about to commit arson," Cooper replied calmly. "There's a difference." Whitman began pacing back and forth in the small office like a caged animal. "Those men were trying to solve a problem that you refused to handle. The Mitchell situation has gone too far." "What situation is that?" Cooper asked, though he already knew the answer. "A white man married to a Chinese woman living in our town like it's normal." Whitman's voice rose with each word. "It's not normal, Ben. It's not right. And it's causing trouble." Cooper stood up slowly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "The only trouble I see is men with torches trying to burn people out of their homes." "You know what I mean," Whitman said, lowering his voice. "This town has a reputation to maintain. We have families to protect. What kind of message does it send when we allow this kind of arrangement? What kind of message does it send when we burn people's houses down?" Cooper shot back. "When we decide that some citizens matter less than others?" Whitman stopped pacing and faced Cooper directly. "I'm not talking about burning anything. I'm talking about encouraging them to leave. Peacefully. And if they refuse, then we make it clear they're not welcome here." Cooper had heard enough. He walked around his desk until he was standing face to face with the mayor. "Harold, let me make something clear to you. Thomas Mitchell and his wife are citizens of this town. They pay their taxes, they follow the law, and they mind their own business. That's all I care about. But the town council, The town council doesn't run the sheriff's office," Cooper interrupted. "I do. And as long as I wear this badge, I'll protect every citizen equally. Chinese, white, or purple with green spots." Whitman's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "You're making a mistake, Ben. The people who voted for you won't stand for this." "Then maybe they'll vote for someone else next time," Cooper said with a shrug. "But until then, this is how it's going to be." After Whitman stormed out, Cooper sat back down at his desk. He knew the mayor was right about one thing: his job was probably on the line. But some things were more important than keeping a job. The door opened again, gentler this time. Doc Matthews walked in, carrying his medical bag and wearing a thoughtful expression. "Morning, Ben," the doctor said. "Heard you had some excitement last night." "News travels fast in a small town," Cooper replied. Doc Matthews sat down in the chair across from Cooper's desk. "I wanted to thank you for what you did. And to tell you something else." "What's that?" "Mae Mitchell has been helping me with some of my patients. Her needlework is the finest I've ever seen. Yesterday, she stitched up a cut on little Jimmy Patterson's arm so perfectly that he won't even have a scar." Cooper raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Patterson let a Chinese woman treat her son?" "Mrs. Patterson wasn't there," Doc Matthews admitted. "The boy had been playing by the creek and fell on some rocks. His older brother brought him to me, but I was shaking too badly to do the fine work needed. May happened to be in my office, picking up some medicine for her husband's headaches. And she took one look at that boy's arm and asked if she could help. Her hands were steady as stone, and she worked so carefully that Jimmy barely felt a thing. When she was done, he thanked her like a little gentleman." Cooper smiled for the first time that morning. "Did you tell Mrs. Patterson what happened?" "I told her that her son received the best medical care available in this town," Doc Matthews said carefully. "I didn't mention who provided it." "Probably wise." Doc Matthews leaned forward in his chair. "Ben, I've been practicing medicine for 20 years. I've seen a lot of people, good and bad. That young woman has a gift for healing. And her husband is one of the most honest men I've met." "I know," Cooper said. "The point is, some of us in this town appreciate what you did last night. We may not be as loud as the others, but we are here." After the doctor left, Cooper felt a little better about his choice. Maybe he would lose his job, and maybe the town would elect someone who would run the Mitchells out. But at least he would be able to look at himself in the mirror. As he was finishing his paperwork, Thomas Mitchell appeared in his doorway. The young man looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes, but he stood straight and proud. "Sheriff Cooper? I wanted to thank you for last night." "Just doing my job," Cooper replied. No, it was more than that, Thomas said. You could have let them burn us out and avoided all the trouble it's causing you. Cooper looked up sharply. What trouble? The whole town's talking about it, Thomas said quietly. Some folks are saying you care more about Chinese people than white people. Others are saying you're not fit to wear that badge. Cooper felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. And what do you think? Thomas smiled, and for the first time since Cooper had known him, he looked completely sure of himself. I think you're exactly the kind of sheriff this town needs. Even if they don't know it yet. As Thomas walked away, Cooper realized something important. Last night hadn't just been about protecting two people from a mob. It had been about deciding what kind of man he wanted to be. And despite all the trouble it might cause him, he was glad he had made the choice he did. Outside his window, Silver Creek went about its daily business. But Cooper knew that something had changed in the town, something that couldn't be undone. The question now was whether the change would make the place better or worse. Only time would tell. The morning after the confrontation, Thomas woke to find their cabin door hanging wide open, cold mountain air rushing through like an unwelcome visitor. His heart hammered against his ribs as he called out, "Li Mei." Silence answered him back. He pulled on his boots and rushed outside, scanning the frost-covered ground for any sign of her. Fresh footprints led away from the cabin toward the forest, but they weren't alone. Other prints surrounded them, deeper and heavier. Men's boots. Thomas grabbed his rifle and followed the trail, his breath coming out in white puffs as he jogged through the pine trees. The tracks led him to a clearing where the remains of a campfire still smoked. Someone had been here recently, very recently. A piece of blue fabric caught on a low branch made his stomach drop. It was from Li Mei's dress, the one she'd worn yesterday. He carefully pulled it free, his hands shaking not from the cold but from fear. Looking for something, Mitchell? Thomas spun around to find Jake Morrison stepping out from behind a large pine tree, a cruel smile spreading across his weathered face. Behind him came three other men, all armed, all looking pleased with themselves. Where is she? Thomas demanded, raising his rifle. Morrison chuckled, a sound like rocks grinding together. Safe and sound for now. But that depends entirely on what you're willing to do to get her back. What do you want? Simple. You pack up your things, take your Chinese girl, and leave Silver Creek today. Forever. Don't look back, don't write letters, don't ever show your faces in this territory again. Thomas's mind raced. Running away felt like giving up, like admitting defeat. But Li Mei's safety mattered more than his pride. And if I refuse? Morrison's smile grew wider and uglier. Well, accidents happen all the time in mining country. Cave-ins, rock slides, people just disappearing into the mountains. Would be a real shame if something happened to such a pretty little thing. The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Thomas knew these men meant business. Morrison had killed before. Everyone in town knew about the claim jumper who'd mysteriously vanished last spring. I need to see her first, Thomas said, lowering his rifle slightly. I need to know she's unharmed. Fair enough. Morrison gestured toward a narrow trail that led deeper into the mountains. She's about a mile up that way in the old Peterson mine shaft. But don't try anything clever, Mitchell. My boys have been watching that entrance all night. As they walked, Thomas's mind worked frantically. The Peterson mine had been abandoned for 2 years after a collapse killed 3 workers. It was dangerous, unstable, and the perfect place to hide someone. It was also the perfect place for an accident to happen. The mine entrance yawned before them like a hungry mouth, dark and forbidding. Thomas could hear water dripping somewhere in the depths, each drop echoing like a countdown. Li Mei, he called out. Her voice came back weak but clear. Thomas. Do not come in. It is trapped. Morrison pushed Thomas forward with the barrel of his gun. Go on in, lover boy. Have your little reunion. But remember what I said, you've got until sunset to be on that train heading east. Thomas stepped into the mine shaft, his eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness. Li Mei sat on the rocky floor about 20 feet in, her hands tied behind her back but otherwise appearing unharmed. Relief flooded through him. Are you hurt? He asked, kneeling beside her. No, but Thomas, the roof, it is not safe. I hear creaking all night. These men, they do not know how dangerous this place is. As if summoned by her words, a shower of small rocks fell from above, clattering around them. The wooden support beams groaned ominously. We need to get out of here, Thomas whispered, working at the ropes around her wrists. Right now. But as he freed her hands, a rumbling sound filled the air. Not thunder, something much worse. The mine shaft was collapsing. Run! Thomas shouted, grabbing Li Mei's hand and pulling her toward the entrance. Behind them, the mountain itself seemed to be falling down. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Rocks bounced off Thomas's shoulders as they ran, Li Mei's smaller frame allowing her to dodge between the falling debris more easily. They burst out of the mine shaft just as the entrance collapsed completely, sealing off the tunnel behind them. Morrison and his men stood frozen, staring at the pile of rock and timber that had nearly become Thomas and Li Mei's grave. Well, Morrison said after a long moment, looks like the mountain solved our problem for us. But Thomas was already moving. The mine collapse had created a diversion, and Morrison's men were distracted by the unexpected turn of events. Thomas tackled the nearest man, wrestling his gun away while Li Mei grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at another attacker. The fight was brief but vicious. Thomas wasn't a natural fighter, but desperation made him strong. When the dust settled, two of Morrison's men lay unconscious on the ground, and Morrison himself was backing away with his hands raised. "This isn't over, Mitchell," Morrison snarled. "You can't fight the whole town." "Maybe not," Thomas replied, breathing hard. "But I don't have to fight the whole town. I just have to fight you." As Morrison and his remaining man retreated into the forest, Thomas and Li Mei stood among the wreckage of the collapsed mine, holding each other tight. They were alive, they were together, but they both knew this was only the beginning of their troubles. "What do we do now?" Li Mei asked, looking at the destruction around them. Thomas thought about Morrison's ultimatum, about the train that would carry them away from Silver Creek forever. Then he thought about Sheriff Cooper, about Doc Matthews, about the other people in town who had shown them kindness. "Now we go back to town," he said firmly. "And we tell everyone what really happened here today." Li Mei looked at him with surprise. "You want to stay? Even after this?" "Especially after this." Thomas took her hand, leading her back toward the trail. "Running away won't stop men like Morrison. It'll just encourage them to keep bullying anyone who's different." As they walked back through the forest, Li Mei was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "In China, we have saying, the tree that bends in the wind survives the storm. But sometimes maybe the tree must learn to stand firm." Thomas squeezed her hand. "Sometimes it must." Behind them, smoke still rose from the collapsed mine, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. But ahead of them lay Silver Creek, their home, and whatever challenges waited there. They would face those challenges together. 3 days after the mine incident, Thomas sat in Sheriff Cooper's office, watching the lawmen study the evidence they brought back from the mountains. Li Mei's torn dress, the rope that had bound her hands, and most importantly, the testimony of Pete Wilson, one of Morrison's men who'd developed a sudden case of conscience after nearly being buried alive. "Pete's willing to testify that Morrison organized the whole thing," Cooper said, leaning back in his chair. "But Jake's got friends on the town council. This won't be easy." Thomas felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. Even with evidence, even with witnesses, Morrison's influence ran deep in Silver Creek. The man owned half the businesses in town and had powerful connections throughout the territory. "What about the attempted murder charges?" Thomas asked. "They tried to kill us in that mine shaft." "That's where it gets tricky," Cooper admitted. "Morrison's claiming the mine collapse was an accident. Says he was just trying to scare you into leaving town, never intended anyone to get hurt." Li Mei, who had been quietly sewing in the corner, looked up from her needlework. "And you believe this?" Cooper's weathered face showed his frustration. "Doesn't matter what I believe, ma'am. Matters what I can prove in court. And Morrison's got enough money to hire the best lawyers in Denver." The office door burst open, making all three of them jump. Doc Matthews stumbled in, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his face flushed with excitement and anger. "Ben, you need to hear this," he said, catching his breath. "I was treating Mrs. Morrison for her headaches again, and she started talking. She's been carrying a load of guilt about something her husband did." Cooper straightened in his chair. "What kind of guilt?" "The kind that involves a dead Chinese miner from last year. Fellow named Chinwei. Remember him? Found at the bottom of Copper Canyon with a broken neck." Thomas felt Li Mei go very still beside him. Chinwei had been her friend, one of the few people who'd helped her when she first arrived in Silver Creek. "We ruled that an accident," Cooper said slowly. "Maybe it wasn't." Doc Matthews pulled out a small notebook. "According to Martha Morrison, her husband came home that night with blood on his shirt and dirt under his fingernails. Told her he'd had to deal with a problem at one of his mining claims." The room fell silent except for the tick of the clock on Cooper's desk. Finally, the sheriff spoke. "Doc, are you sure about this? Because if you're wrong..." "I'm not wrong. Martha Morrison is eaten up with guilt. She wants to testify, Ben. She wants to tell the truth about what her husband's been doing to the Chinese workers." Thomas looked at Li Mei, seeing the mixture of hope and pain in her eyes. Qinwei had been like a brother to her, one of the few connections she'd had to her homeland and her past. There's more, Doc Matthews continued. Martha says Jake's been running a protection racket on the Chinese miners for months. Pay him a percentage of their gold or suffer mysterious accidents. Qinwei refused to pay. Cooper stood up, reaching for his hat. Pete Wilson's testimony just got a lot more valuable. If we can prove Morrison killed Qinwei, the kidnapping charges will seem like child's play. What about Martha Morrison? Thomas asked. Will she really testify against her own husband? She's scared, Doc Matthews said. But she's also tired of living with a murderer. I think she'll find the courage when the time comes. As they prepared to leave the sheriff's office, Li Mei caught Thomas's arm. This is dangerous, she said quietly. Morrison, he will not go quietly. He will fight. I know, Thomas replied. But we can't let fear win. Not anymore. That evening, they sat in their cabin, making plans for the trial that would determine not just Morrison's fate, but the future of Chinese workers throughout the territory. Li Mei had contacted other miners, other families who had suffered under Morrison's threats. They are willing to speak, she told Thomas. But they are afraid. Morrison has hurt many people. Then we'll have to show them they're not alone, Thomas said. We'll have to prove that standing together is stronger than standing apart. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Thomas reached for his rifle, but Li Mei put a hand on his arm. Wait, she said. Listen. The knock came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. Thomas opened the door to find a young Chinese woman standing on their porch, holding a small child. Please, she said in broken English. I am widow of Qinwei. I hear you fight Morrison. I want to help. Thomas and Li Mei exchanged glances. This was Qinwei's wife, the woman whose husband had died because he refused to pay Morrison's bloody tax. Come in, Li Mei said, switching to Chinese. Coming out of the cold. As the woman entered with her child, Thomas realized their cabin was about to become something more than a home. It was becoming a gathering place, a symbol of resistance against the fear and hatred that had ruled Silver Creek for too long. Over the next few hours, more people arrived. Pete Wilson came first, nervously looking over his shoulder. Then came Doc Matthews with Martha Morrison, her face pale but determined. Finally, Sheriff Cooper arrived with 2 deputies from the county seat. Well, Cooper said, looking around the crowded cabin, looks like we've got ourselves a proper investigation. Thomas stood by the fireplace, looking at the faces around him, Chinese miners, their families, white townspeople who had decided to stand up for what was right. Li Mei stood beside him, her hand in his, both of them understanding that tomorrow would change everything. Whatever happens, Thomas said to the room, we face it together. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Silver Creek in a blanket of white. But inside the cabin, warmed by the fire and the courage of people who had decided to stand up for justice, the future looked brighter than it had in a very long time. The real fight was just beginning. The smell of fresh sawdust and fear filled the air as Thomas burst through the cabin door, his face white as winter snow. Li Mei looked up from her sewing, needle frozen halfway through the blue fabric that would become her wedding dress. We have to leave? Tonight. His words came out in short bursts, like a man who had been running. Jake Morrison just bought the land our cabin sits on. He's giving us 3 days to get out. Li Mei set down her needle with steady hands, though her heart hammered like rain on a tin roof. How much land? All of it. The whole valley. Thomas slumped into the wooden chair, his head falling into his hands. He used his cattle money to buy it from the railroad company. Claims he's going to expand his ranch. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Li Mei had seen this look before, the same hopeless expression her father wore when the tax collectors came to their village in China. But Thomas wasn't her father, and she wasn't the same frightened girl who had crossed the ocean. Where we go if we leave? She asked, her voice calm as still water. Denver, maybe? Or San Francisco? Thomas lifted his head. Somewhere big enough that people won't notice us. Li Mei walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had become home. The aspens were turning yellow, painting the hillsides in gold. She had planted a small garden behind the cabin, vegetables that reminded her of home, mixed with American corn and beans. Now someone else would harvest what she had sown. I not want to run, she said quietly. Thomas stood up, moving beside her at the window. I don't want to run either. But Morrison has the law on his side. And the money. And half the town backing him up. What other half think? Thomas considered this. Doc Matthews likes us. Sheriff Cooper's been fair. Mrs. Chin from the laundry thinks you're good for business in Chinatown. Then maybe we fight. The word hung in the air between them. Thomas had grown up in Boston, where fights were settled with lawyers and family connections. Li Mei had grown up in a world where you fought with whatever tools you had or you didn't survive. How do we fight someone with Morrison's power? Thomas asked. Li Mei turned from the window, her dark eyes bright with an idea that was just beginning to form. We make our own power. She moved to the wooden chest where she kept her few precious things. From the bottom, wrapped in silk, she pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside were gold coins, more than Thomas had ever seen her with. Where did you get that? I save. Every penny from sewing. Every coin from helping Doc Matthews. Li Mei counted the coins carefully. $43. Thomas stared. You've been saving this whole time? In China we say, even tall tree can be cut down by many small axes. Morrison think he has all the power. But power come from people, not just money. Li Mei moved around the cabin with purpose now, gathering supplies. Mrs. Chin has 3 sisters in San Francisco. They have money, they have friends. Chinese community take care of each other because no one else will. You want to ask them for help? I want to make deal with them. Li Mei's voice grew stronger with each word. Morrison want Chinese people out of Silver Creek. But Chinese workers built the railroad. Chinese laundry clean the clothes. Chinese cook feed the workers. Thomas began to understand. If the Chinese community stopped working, town stopped working. Li Mei smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had found a weapon she knew how to use. Morrison can buy land, but he cannot buy rice from thin air. He cannot wash his clothes with wishes. As night fell, they made their plans. Li Mei would ride to the Chinese quarter before dawn, while Thomas would visit Doc Matthews and Sheriff Cooper. They would have 3 days to build their own power before Morrison expected them to leave. This could make things worse, Thomas warned as they prepared for bed. Li Mei blew out the lamp, leaving only the dying fire for light. Things already bad. Now we choose how to be bad, running like scared rabbits, or standing like people who have right to be here. Outside, an all called through the darkness. Thomas lay on his bedroll, listening to Li Mei's breathing slow into sleep. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't imagine. But for the first time since Morrison's threat, he felt something other than fear. He felt ready to fight. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with storm clouds building over the mountains. Li Mei dressed in her best clothes, the green dress she wore to church with her jade bracelet polished bright. If she was going to ask for help, she would do it with dignity. Remember, Thomas said as she prepared to leave, don't promise anything we can't deliver. Li Mei mounted the old mare they had bought from a farmer down the valley. In China we say, words are like arrows, once released, they cannot be called back. I will be careful with my arrows today. As she rode toward town, Thomas watched until she disappeared around the bend. Then he saddled his own horse and rode in the opposite direction toward Doc Matthews' house. The smell of snow was in the air and winter was coming fast. By noon, Li Mei had spoken with 5 Chinese families, 2 restaurant owners, and the head of the local miners' association. The news she brought back made Thomas's hands shake. Morrison not just buying our land, she announced, dropping into the chair with exhaustion. He buying all Chinese businesses too. Offering half what they worth, telling owners they better sell or face trouble. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. He's trying to drive out the entire Chinese community. Mrs. Chen's nephew heard Morrison talking at the saloon last night. He say Silver Creek should be for white people only. Say if law won't remove Chinese, maybe other methods will work better. The threat was clear. Morrison wasn't just expanding his ranch, he was waging war on anyone who didn't fit his vision of what the town should be. What did the families say? Thomas asked. Li Mei's smile returned, sharp as a blade. They say if Morrison want war, he picked wrong people to fight. That evening, as the first snow began to fall, Li Mei and Thomas stood at their window watching lights flicker on throughout the valley. Tomorrow would bring Morrison's answer to their refusal to leave. Tonight was their last night of peace. Are you scared? Thomas asked. Li Mei touched her jade bracelet, thinking of her father's words about America being a place where anything was possible. Yes. But fear and courage can live in same heart. My grandmother teach me that. Outside, the snow fell harder, covering the ground in white. Winter was coming to Silver Creek, and with it, the fight that would determine not just their future, but the future of everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The sound of hammering echoed across the valley like thunder as the sun rose on Morrison's deadline day. Li Mei woke to find Thomas already dressed, standing at the window with his jaw tight as wire. What's that noise? Morrison's men. They're building something on the hill overlooking town. Thomas's voice carried a chill colder than the morning air. Looks like a platform. Li Mei joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she saw the wooden structure taking shape. She had seen platforms like that before in San Francisco where angry crowds gathered to demand the removal of Chinese workers. He's planning a rally, she whispered. A knock at the door made them both jump. Thomas opened it to find Sheriff Cooper, his hat in his hands and worry lines deep around his eyes. Morning, folks. Mind if I come in? Li Mei quickly poured coffee while the sheriff settled into their kitchen chair. Cooper looked older than his 40 years, gray showing in his brown hair. I'll get straight to the point, Cooper said. Morrison's called for a town meeting tonight. Says he has important news about cleaning up Silver Creek. Cleaning up? Thomas's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. His words, not mine. Cooper rubbed his forehead. He's got support, Thomas. Folks are scared about Chinese workers taking jobs, scared about changes coming to town. Fear makes people do ugly things. Li Mei sat down across from the sheriff. What you think we should do? Cooper studied her face, seeing something there that made him choose his words carefully. I think you should know that not everyone in town agrees with Morrison. Doc Matthews has been talking to people. Mrs. Henderson from the hotel says Chinese workers are the most reliable help she's ever had. How many people? Thomas asked. Maybe a third of the town. Problem is, they're quiet people. Good people, but not fighters. Cooper's voice dropped lower. Morrison's people are fighters. Li Mei stood and walked to their small bookshelf, pulling out a leather journal. She had been writing in it every day since coming to Silver Creek, recording the kindnesses and cruelties, the names of friends and enemies. Sheriff Cooper, you good man. But good men sometimes have to choose sides. Cooper nodded slowly. I know. Question is, what side you want me to choose? Before Li Mei could answer, another knock came at the door. This time it was Mrs. Chin from the laundry, accompanied by 3 Chinese men Thomas didn't recognize. Li Mei, Mrs. Chin said in rapid Chinese, then switched to English for the other's benefit. These are my cousins from Denver. They came as soon as they got my message. The oldest cousin, a man with graying hair and calloused hands, stepped forward. I am Chin Wei Ming. I build railroads for 15 years. I know what men like Morrison do when they get power. What do they do? Thomas asked. They start with Chinese, but they not stop there. Next they come for Irish, for Mexicans, for anyone who look different or think different. Wei Ming's English was careful but clear. We stop them here, or we stop them nowhere. Sheriff Cooper looked uncomfortable. Now, I can't have you folks talking about taking the law into your own hands. We not take law into hands, Li Mei said firmly. We use law to protect hands. Wei Ming reached into his coat and pulled out a rolled paper. This is deed to land in Chinatown. Morrison tried to buy, but Chinese Benevolent Association in San Francisco buy first. We pay double what land worth. Thomas stared at the document. You bought the land? All of it. Every building, every business in Chinese Quarter now belonged to association. Wei Ming's smile was quiet but satisfied. Morrison cannot force out people from their own land. Sheriff Cooper examined the deed, his eyebrows rising. This is legal. Properly filed and everything. That's not all, Mrs. Chin added. Association also buy building where Morrison keep his cattle feed, and warehouse where he store grain for winter. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Morrison had been so focused on buying residential land that he hadn't protected his business properties. How much did this cost? Thomas asked. Chinese workers in California take up collection. Send money to help Silver Creek families. Li Mei's voice carried pride and something else, the strength that came from knowing you weren't fighting alone. Wei Ming unrolled another paper. We also hire lawyer from Denver. Real lawyer who know mining law and railroad law. He finds something interesting about Morrison's land purchase. Thomas leaned forward. What? Railroad company not have right to sell that land. Belong to federal government for mining claims. Morrison's purchase not legal. Sheriff Cooper whistled low. That's a serious problem for Morrison. Only if someone challenge it in court, Wei Ming said. Cost money. Take time. But Chinese association ready to fight. Li Mei looked at Thomas, seeing the hope and fear warring in his eyes. What you think? Thomas thought about the man he had been a year ago, afraid of conflict, afraid of standing out, afraid of being judged. Then he thought about the man Li Mei had helped him become. I think Morrison picked the wrong fight with the wrong people. As the morning wore on, more visitors arrived at the cabin. Doc Matthews came with news that several of his patients had expressed support for Lee May and Thomas. Mrs. Henderson from the hotel brought word that 3 other business owners were ready to stand against Morrison's pressure. By afternoon, their small cabin had become the center of something none of them had expected, a community of people who refused to be driven out by fear and hatred. Tonight will be test, Weiming said as they made final plans. Morrison expect Chinese people to hide, to run away. Instead, we show up. We speak. We stand. Lee May touched her jade bracelet, thinking of her grandmother's words about courage and fear living in the same heart. Tonight, the whole town would see which was stronger. As evening approached and the first stars appeared over the mountains, Lee May and Thomas walked hand in hand toward the center of Silver Creek. Behind them came their friends and allies, Chinese and white, old and young, all united by the simple belief that home was something worth fighting for. The platform Morrison had built loomed ahead, surrounded by flickering torches and the murmur of gathering crowds. Whatever happened tonight would determine not just their future, but the soul of Silver Creek itself. Ready? Thomas asked as they approached the crowd. Lee May squeezed his hand, her voice steady as mountain stone. Ready. The sound of hammering filled the air as Thomas climbed onto the wooden platform where everything had started 3 years ago. This time, dozens of families gathered around, their faces turned up toward him with respect instead of mockery. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders and women held babies close as the whole town waited to hear what he had to say. Friends and neighbors, Thomas began, his voice carrying across the crowd like a church bell on Sunday morning. 3 years ago, I stood on this very spot as a stranger who didn't know if he belonged anywhere. Lee May watched from the front row, her hands folded over her growing belly. Their baby would be born before winter, and already she could feel the little one moving inside her. She smiled as Thomas found her eyes in the crowd, giving him the strength to continue. Back then, I thought being worth something meant having other people tell you that you mattered, Thomas said. I spent my whole life in Boston trying to make my father proud, trying to fit into boxes that were too small for who I really was. Mrs. Patterson stood near the back of the crowd, her face softer than it had been in years. She had come to Lee May just last week when her youngest daughter fell and cut her arm badly. Lee May had sewn the wound so carefully that it would barely leave a scar. Sometimes healing happens one stitch at a time. But I learned something important here in Silver Creek, Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. I learned that real worth doesn't come from what people think about you. It comes from what you do when nobody is watching. It comes from standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. These people had watched Thomas and Lee May face down angry neighbors and cruel gossip. They had seen them work side by side, building something beautiful from nothing but determination and love. Sheriff Cooper nodded from his spot near the platform. He remembered that cold night when the mob had come for Lee May and how Thomas had stepped between them without hesitation. That was the moment Cooper knew these two were different from what people said about them. My wife taught me that courage isn't about not being scared, Thomas said, his eyes finding Lee May again. It's about doing the right thing even when your knees are shaking and your heart is pounding so loud you think everyone can hear it. Lee May touched her jade bracelet, thinking about all the times she had been afraid but kept going anyway. Coming to America had been scary. Standing up to the people who wanted to hurt her had been scary. Falling in love with Thomas had been the scariest thing of all because love meant trusting someone with your whole heart. Doc Matthews stepped forward from the crowd. Thomas, we all know what you and Lee May have meant to this town. When my grandson broke his leg last summer, Lee May sat with him all night while I set the bone. She sang him songs from her country until the pain went away. And when the Henderson farm caught fire, called out Jim Henderson, Thomas was the first one there with buckets, even though some of us hadn't been too friendly to him before. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. These were the same people who had once crossed the street to avoid him and Lee May. Now they were standing up for them in front of the whole town. The railroad is finished now, Thomas said, gesturing toward the gleaming tracks that stretched toward the mountains. Trains will bring new people to Silver Creek every day. Some of them will look different from us. Some will speak different languages or pray to different gods. The crowd grew quiet, sensing that something important was coming. When those new people arrive, they're going to watch how we treat them. They're going to learn what kind of town this is by what they see us do. And I hope they see a place where people are judged by what they do, not what they look like. Morrison stood near the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed over his chest. He had been one of the loudest voices against Thomas and Lee May in the beginning. But his own daughter had been sick with fever last winter, and Lee May had brought herbs that helped break it. It was hard to hate someone who had saved your child's life. Some of you might remember the night I first came to Silver Creek, Thomas continued. I made a choice that night that changed everything. Not just for me, but for all of us. Because every time we choose kindness over cruelty, every time we choose understanding over fear, we make our whole community stronger. Li Mei stood up slowly, her hand on her back where the baby made everything ache. Thomas saw her movement and smiled, reaching down to help her onto the platform. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, but most watched with warmth as Thomas guided his wife to stand beside him. Li Mei has something she wants to say too, Thomas announced. Li Mei looked out at the faces in the crowd, seeing people who had become friends, neighbors who had learned to trust her, children who waved when they saw her in the street. Her English was much better now, but she still felt nervous speaking to so many people at once. When I first come to America, she began, her voice clear and strong despite her nervousness, I think this country will give me chance to build new life. But people see my face, hear my voice, and they think they know who I am before I even speak. The crowd listened intently, many hearing Li Mei's full story for the first time. Thomas, he see me different, she continued, her hand finding his. He see person, not just Chinese girl. He give me chance to show who I really am inside. Old Sam Wheeler, who had once accused Li Mei of stealing, felt his cheeks burn with shame. She had been in his store just yesterday, helping his wife pick out fabric for a new dress, chatting and laughing like old friends. Now I know that America is not just place on map, Li Mei said, her voice growing stronger. America is idea. Idea that says all people deserve chance to make good life, no matter where they come from or what they look like. The crowd erupted in applause and Li Mei felt tears spring to her eyes. These people who had once looked at her with suspicion and fear were now clapping for her words, nodding in agreement with what she said. But even as the crowd cheered, Li Mei noticed a group of men standing apart from the celebration, their faces dark with anger. She recognized Jake Morrison's brother Sam, who had just arrived on the morning train from Denver. Beside him stood 3 other men she didn't know, all watching the celebration with hostile eyes. Thomas saw them too and felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm afternoon sun. The battle for acceptance in Silver Creek might be won, but it seemed like new challenges were already on their way. The celebration was still going strong when the trouble started. Li Mei was sitting in a chair someone had brought for her, accepting congratulations from neighbors when she saw Sam Morrison push through the crowd with his 3 companions. Their faces were hard and she could smell whiskey on their breath even from several feet away. Well, Sam Morrison called out loudly, his voice cutting through the happy chatter like a knife. Looks like my brother was right about this town going soft. Having a party for a Chinaman and her pet white boy. The crowd fell silent instantly. Children moved closer to their parents, and several men stepped protectively in front of their families. Sheriff Cooper began walking toward the group, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Thomas jumped down from the platform, placing himself between Sam Morrison and Li Mei. You're drunk, Morrison. This is a peaceful gathering. Why don't you sleep it off and we can talk tomorrow when your head's clear? Don't tell me what to do, boy, Sam snarled. I've been hearing all about you and your yellow wife from my dear brother Jake. Says you think you're better than the rest of us good Christian folk. Li Mei struggled to her feet, one hand on her belly and the other gripping the chair for support. Something was wrong. The baby was moving differently and sharp pains were shooting through her back. But she couldn't show weakness now, not when Thomas needed her to be strong. We don't think we're better than anyone, Thomas said calmly, though his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. We just want to live our lives in peace. Peace? One of Sam's companions, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, laughed harshly. You call it peaceful when decent white women have to watch their children play alongside half-breed babies? When good men lose jobs to Chinamen who work for pennies? Doc Matthews stepped forward, his medical bag in his hand. That's enough talk like that. This is a family celebration and there are children present. Children who shouldn't have to see this disgrace, the scarred man shot back. Time to clean up this town before it gets any worse. Li Mei gasped as another sharp pain cut through her middle. This wasn't the baby moving anymore. This was something else, something that made her knees weak and her vision blur around the edges. She tried to call out to Thomas, but the words wouldn't come. Mrs. Patterson, who had been standing nearby, noticed Li Mei's distress immediately. Whatever her past feelings about the couple, she was a mother first and she recognized the signs of a woman in trouble. Doctor, she called sharply. Something's wrong with Li Mei. Thomas spun around to see his wife doubled over, her face pale and twisted with pain. He forgot all about Sam Morrison and his threats, rushing to Lee May's side just as her legs gave out beneath her. "The baby," Lee May whispered as Thomas caught her in his arms. "Something wrong with baby." Doc Matthews was there in seconds, his trained hands checking Lee May's pulse and feeling her forehead for fever. "We need to get her home right now," he said urgently. "This could be serious." "She's faking it," Sam Morrison called out, trying to get sympathy because she knows she's not wanted here. The words hit the crowd like a slap. Even people who had been uncertain about Lee May before were outraged by such cruelty toward a woman who was clearly in pain. Jim Henderson, whose farm Thomas had helped save from fire, stepped forward with several other men. "Morrison, you and your friends need to leave. Now." "We're not going anywhere," Sam replied, pulling a bottle from his coat pocket and taking a long drink. "This is still America, and Americans have a right to speak their minds about threats to their community." Sheriff Cooper had heard enough. "Sam Morrison, you're drunk and disturbing the peace. Get on the next train out of town or spend the week in my jail sobering up." "You going to arrest me for telling the truth?" Sam demanded. "For pointing out that this town is being overrun by foreigners and the fools who coddle them?" Lee May cried out as another wave of pain washed over her, this one so strong that she couldn't hold back the sound. Thomas looked desperately at Doc Matthews, who was already organizing several women to help carry Lee May home. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you and Mrs. Henderson to help me get Lee May to her house," Doc Matthews ordered. "Thomas, you carry her, but be gentle. We don't know what's happening yet." As Thomas lifted his wife in his arms, he felt how light she had become, how fragile. Lee May had always been small, but now she seemed to weigh no more than a bird. Her face was gray with pain, and her breathing was quick and shallow. "Stay with me," he whispered in her ear as he began walking toward their house. "Stay with me, Lee May. Don't you dare leave me now." The crowd parted to let them through, many people reaching out to touch Lee May's hand or Thomas's shoulder as they passed. Sam Morrison and his friends stood watching, their earlier bravado fading as they saw the genuine concern on every face around them. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Thomas called back to them as he walked. "To hurt her so badly that she can't stay? Well, look at what your hatred has accomplished. Look at what your words have done to an innocent woman and her unborn child." Even Sam Morrison had the grace to look uncomfortable as the full weight of the situation hit him. Whatever his feelings about Chinese immigrants, he had never intended to cause harm to a pregnant woman. At the house, Doc Matthews worked quickly while Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Henderson boiled water and gathered clean cloths. Thomas sat beside the bed, holding Lee May's hand and whispering words of encouragement as she fought through each wave of pain. "Is she going to be all right?" Thomas asked when the doctor stepped outside for a moment. Doc Matthews looked tired and worried. "I don't know yet. The baby is coming early, maybe too early. And Lee May has lost some blood. The next few hours will tell us everything." Thomas felt his world tilting sideways. After everything they had been through, after all the battles they had won, was he going to lose Lee May to the hatred of men like Sam Morrison? Was their story going to end before their child even had a chance to begin? Inside the house, Lee May gripped the sheets and thought about her parents back in China, about the jade bracelet that had traveled so far from home. She thought about Thomas, about the man who had seen her worth when no one else would. She thought about the baby growing inside her, the child who would be both Chinese and American, both her heritage and their future. She was not going to let go without a fight. Not now, not when they were so close to having everything they had dreamed of. But as another contraction gripped her body, Lee May wondered if love and determination would be enough to overcome the forces that seemed determined to tear their family apart before it could truly begin. Outside, the celebration had turned into a prayer vigil, with neighbors gathering to wait for news and offer whatever help they could. And somewhere in the growing darkness, Sam Morrison sat alone with his bottle, finally beginning to understand the difference between standing up for your beliefs and simply spreading hate. The night was far from over, and nobody knew yet whether it would end with joy or heartbreak.